Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Bullet Points Lunchtime webinar series on firearm injury prevention for clinicians. I'm Amy Barnhorst. I'm the director of Bullet Points Project, and I'm moderating today's session. And we're really excited to have Dr. Tate Guelzow. I hope I said that right, Tate. I always get it wrong.
You nailed it. Story of my life.
He's from the San Francisco VA Medical Center, and he is an expert in suicide prevention in veterans. And he's going to talk about some broad trends in veteran suicide by firearms and some recent efforts at the VA to disseminate and encourage culturally sensitive lethal means safety counseling practices. First, a couple of announcements. Mark your calendars for the third Tuesday of every month. We have this webinar at noon, and it's just for a half hour, so you can bring your lunch and learn while you eat. And we hope that you will join us next month. Also, these webinars are all recorded and posted on our website. At the beginning of each webinar, we'll have a poll. So we'll have our poll launched very soon. And next month's webinar is going to be on November 16th at noon with Narisha Harris, Chevis Johnson, and Esmeralda Huerta, who are violence intervention specialists. And they're going to talk about their experience with the UC Davis Wraparound Trauma Prevention Program. So real quick, we're going to open the poll, and it'll take just a minute or two to complete, and then I'll introduce Dr. Guelzow. Okay, thank you everyone for completing that poll. And just as a reminder, this is a webinar, so the chat function is disabled, but the Q&A function on the Zoom is where you can put questions. At the end of Dr. Guelzow's presentation, I will go through the questions and I will present them. I'll kind of put some of them together if they're of similar content, and he'll have a chance to answer those and we can have some discussion. So without further delay, I'll introduce Dr. Brian Tate Guelzow, who's a psychologist at the San Francisco VA Healthcare System Suicide Prevention Program. He earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley and completed his predoctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the San Francisco VA. He joined the suicide prevention program in 2014, and he assists in the clinical management of high-risk patients, the education of staff, trainees, and community partners, and the implementation of the mandated best practices throughout the healthcare system. His current areas of interest in the field include narrative approaches to suicide risk assessment, critical suicidology, and effective strategies for supporting clinicians who've lost a patient to suicide. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Guelzow, and I will let you take it away from here.
All right, fabulous. Whoops. I don't know how long this pandemic is going to need to go on before I get proficient with Zoom. There we go. All right. So just to start out, I'm going to be discussing a lethal means safety counseling training that was developed in collaboration between the San Francisco VA Suicide Prevention Program, the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, and a number of other VA stakeholders. And those are listed here. I've also given my contact information, and I'd really encourage folks, please do reach out if you're interested in learning more about this. Also, we give this training with some regularity in the community. We're able to adapt it a bit. And if you're from an organization that you think this might be helpful for your providers, definitely reach out and let me know, and we can see if we can work something out. Okay, so just a broad outline of what I'll be covering today. So I'm going to start out by talking about veterans and firearm suicides and some of the most recent extant data that we've got. And then I'm going to give a bit of a brief history of lethal means safety counseling efforts and training in the VA system. And then I'll just end by giving sort of a whirlwind tour of the lethal means safety counseling training program as it currently stands in the VA. And I'll just sort of give you a flavor of what we give our providers to this end. So just to start out with sort of the 35,000-foot view, as I'm sure some of y'all are aware, or many of y'all are aware, U.S. suicide rates broadly have been on the increase for the last 2 decades. Between 1999 and 2018, there was a 35% increase in the overall U.S. suicide rate. U.S. suicide rates have been at about a 50-year high for the last couple of years, although they did actually come down a bit between 2018 and 2019. So each year, the VA publishes a large VA suicide data report. The most recent one just came out about 2 weeks ago. And it found that in 2019, which is the most recent year that we've got data for, the veteran suicide rate was 53% higher than in non-veterans. And in 2017, Just to sort of give a reference point, veterans constitute about 8% of the US populations, but they accounted for about 13.5% of US suicides. So between 2008 and 2019, every year there have been over 6,000 veteran suicide deaths. And as we'll be discussing at great length today, 69% of 2019 veteran suicide deaths occurred via firearm, compared to 48% of non-veteran suicide deaths. So veterans tend to die at a higher rate of firearm suicide than their non-veteran counterparts. So one piece of encouraging news that I have to include, because I've been in this job for coming up on 7 years, and it was really exciting to see the latest data report, because there hasn't been a lot of good news, in the years I've been in this job. But between 2018 and 2019, there were 399 fewer veteran suicide deaths in the US. That is a 7.2% reduction, which is unprecedented in the last 20 years. So that's encouraging. And just so you know, the higher rates of veteran suicide actually bucks historical trends. So until these last 2 decades, historically veterans have performed better on a lot of different public health measures, including suicide. This is referred to as the healthy warrior or the healthy veteran effect, and it's thought to reflect stringent screening to get into the military. The causes of this shift from lower rates to higher rates are not very well understood. They're certainly multifactorial. Suicide, whenever you're talking about suicide, I always stress complexity, 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 right? There's a lot of different pathways that can lead to this same outcome. But that being said, it does appear that firearms are a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to veterans and suicide. So we know that veterans own firearms at a rate that is higher than their non-veteran counterparts. So if you look at these graphs, or these charts rather, female veterans own firearms at a rate that's about double that of their non-veteran counterparts. So 24% of female vets versus 12% of female non-veterans. Male veterans own firearms at about 15% higher rate than their non-veteran counterparts. So 47% in this study versus 32% in non-veteran males. And we also know that vets don't just own firearms at a higher rate, they tend to own a lot of firearms. So this was a study that was conducted in 2018 by Simonetti and colleagues, or published rather in 2018. And they looked at over 1,000 veteran respondents. And in this study, 45% endorsed owning one or more firearms. And they found that the average number for those that reported owning a firearm, the average number of firearms in the household was 6. And among those firearm owners, 1 in 3 reported that they stored one or more firearms loaded and unlocked. And that is a means of storage, practice of storage that is associated with a 3 to 4 times elevated risk in suicide, per a study by Dempsey et al. And JAMA in 2019. And indeed, we do see, and this holds up year in and year out, veterans of both genders do tend to die by firearm suicide at rates that are higher than their non-veteran counterparts. So this is data from it's from the 2021 data report of 2019 data. And female veterans, about half died by firearm suicide. About half of veteran suicide decedents died by firearm. And that's compared to about 30% roughly of female non-veterans. In males, the rates are higher across the board than they are for females, which goes a long way for explaining why roughly 70% of suicides in the US are in Caucasian males. That's largely a reflection of the fact that they use firearms much more than females. So in male non-veterans in 2019, 53% used a firearm for suicide, while 70% of veterans used firearms in their completed suicides. So in 2007, the VA and the Department of Defense teamed up to initiate one of the largest ongoing suicide prevention efforts to date that's ever been done. Sort of the central thrusts of it involve the placement of suicide prevention teams, dedicated suicide prevention teams at VA medical centers around the country. So there's hundreds of us, sprinkled all around the country. So our team, just for example, here in San Francisco, has 4 people, myself, 2 other psychologists, and a social worker. We've got a range of tasks that lists some of them there, and there's many more. But one thing that's proven true since the suicide prevention program was initiated is that it's been a really sort of good incubator for some really interesting ideas and exciting collaborations, both within the VA and then also between the VA and community partners. And so I'm going to talk a bit about one that focuses on lethal means safety counseling as a key component for veteran suicide prevention initiatives. So sort of most broadly, lethal means safety counseling involves a collaborative, individualized, patient-centered conversation between vets and providers regarding steps to store firearms and other lethal means more safely during periods of elevated risk for suicide. So sort of pared down a bit, the behavioral goal of lethal means safety counseling is a flexible approach to means storage that's responsive to fluctuations in levels of risk. And the broad idea is to reduce and slow access to lethal means during crises. And, the way that I'll talk about this very often with vets is, it's about putting decision points or sort of speed bumps between impulse and action when you're in a period where your risk is a bit higher, for whatever reason that might be. So the best rationale and sort of the best capturing of the spirit of lethal means safety that I've ever seen is in this project that's been developed, this nonprofit called overwatchproject.org. It's sort of like for veterans by veterans. And I would strongly encourage, if this is an area of interest to you, go check out these videos. It's a phenomenal website. And these are 3 combat vets who discuss the way that they've sort of instituted lethal means safety precautions in their own lives. And so this gentleman on the right, his name is Jay Zimmerman, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak. He's a peer support specialist at the Mountain Home VA in Tennessee, and he presents a lot on lethal means safety counseling. And he's an Afghanistan combat medic, and he's an open carry guy. He carries a weapon with him, pretty much at all times, and he makes no bones about that. But he talks about too how he has certain combat anniversaries that are particularly difficult. He also lost a very dear friend to suicide, and he's developed a very, very rigorous, very methodical plan involving a number of different folks in his support network to during those times basically hold on to his firearms because that's a period of elevated risk for him. So I would really encourage to everybody to check out those videos. They're extraordinary. They're really wonderful. And so lethal means safety counseling, the rationale sort of emerged from a number of population-based studies that have shown that reducing access to highly lethal means that are readily available in an environment can be associated with some pretty dramatic reductions in suicide rates. So one of the more famous studies around this was a 2006 study conducted on the Israeli Defense Force, basically as part of a larger, I'm sorry, actually, no, this is a 2010 study. But in 2006, the IDF began requiring soldiers to leave their service weapons on base over the weekend rather than taking them home. And what they found was there was a 40% decrease in the overall rate of suicide in IDF in the 2 years that followed. And if you work in suicide prevention, if you can move the needle even a percentage point or 2, you're absolutely thrilled. So 40% is quite compelling. A similar study that we also talk about in the training that we provide, in 1995, Sri Lanka had one of the highest rates of suicide in the world. It's about 47 per 100,000. Right now, the US is at a 50-year high with 15 per 100,000. So that gives you some idea. And about 2/3 of those suicide deaths at that point in Sri Lanka occurred via pesticide ingestion. It's a highly agrarian society, so that's actually pretty common around the world in similar societies. So in 1995, the government banned a number of the most highly toxic pesticide formulations. And what they found was in the ensuing 10 years, the national suicide rate fell 50%. So again, that's astonishing. And a point that I think is just absolutely fascinating in that study, it's the Gunnell et al. 2007 study. The rate of attempts via pesticide ingestion did not drop. They were just much less likely to be fatal, right? So people's behavior didn't change. It's just that the lethality of the means they were using dropped considerably, right? So both of these studies really point to reduction in access to highly available lethal means can really lead to a significant decrement in suicide risk or suicide rates. So lethal means safety counseling, it's interesting. I first started attending, when I came onto our team, we had some stuff that had been up and running for about a year. And back then it was a much tougher sell. Folks were a lot more skittish about it. And it seems like it's been increasingly embraced sort of more broadly, both within and outside of the VA. But that being said, there are still a lot of misgivings that come up for providers. And these are enumerated pretty nicely in an article that was recently published by Hoyt et al., which sort of articulates the recommended approach to lethal means safety counseling that the VA takes. So that's a nice reference if you're interested in it. And some of the provider concerns that they talked about, you know, a lot of providers may be afraid to discuss lethal means access and firearm access in particular, out of fears that it might violate laws or institutional policies, even though there have been a number of court cases that have upheld providers' rights to do so. They may also fear that talking about firearms with their patients may damage therapeutic alliance, may decrease rapport, may, you know, basically may make their patients angry. Oftentimes too, providers may lack comfort and familiarity with firearms, which can make lethal means safety conversations a bit more awkward. Our team actually, maybe 5 years ago, took a group of mental health providers to a gun range in South San Francisco to sort of increase their familiarity and, you know, just basic knowledge of firearms. And these concerns can be particularly acute in VA settings. And, you know, I think that stems from, you know, not always, but oftentimes there is sort of a bit of a divide politically between providers and patients. That's just fact. And so, you know, and providers feel that, patients can feel that. And so sometimes, you know, the idea of discussing guns in the VA, I think, can be particularly intimidating for providers. You know, and indeed, vets may be more reluctant to engage with lethal means safety conversations due to a number of different considerations. And these have been borne out both in that Hoyt article and then also in another one by Simonetti et al. From Plus One back in 2020. And these are some of the things that may sort of give veterans pause about these conversations. So first of all, there tends to be pretty broad stigma. It's getting a bit better, but there's broad stigma about discussing mental health concerns, particularly with regard to suicidality. In military culture, there's a real focus on gutting it out, you know, being tough, sort of not dragging your team down. And also, you know, there's a very real, there's an absolute reality, which is if you disclose suicidality while you serve, you do run the risk of losing your security clearance, possibly not being promoted, things of that nature. Also, there's often a really strong association between gun ownership and the veteran's identity. Firearm ownership is a right that a lot of vets hold very, very dear. And many vets come from families, although I always stress vets are not a monolith at all. But that being said, many vets do come from families where military service and firearm ownership are cherished rights and things that they take very seriously and hold very dear. Also, vets may have concerns. They may tie their firearm ownership to concerns for household and personal safety. That obviously may be particularly acute when you're dealing with combat vets and vets who struggle with PTSD. Also, vets may have skepticism and distrust of the VA and also the federal government more broadly. Sometimes you do encounter folks who receive lethal means safety counseling initially with skepticism, you know, concerns that it may be sort of leading towards some sort of gun grab. That's something I've encountered. I mean, I've had, I don't even know at this point, probably hundreds of these conversations. Also, vets are overrepresented in fields that require that they use firearms. So things like law enforcement, security, park rangers, things of that nature. And that can certainly complicate lethal means safety efforts. And then finally, you know, very often firearms are really central to vets' social lives, you know, so things like hunting, things like sport shooting, target shooting, going to the gun range. That's a really cherished pastime for a lot of vets. So oftentimes, you know, folks may worry, like, you know, if I do this, if I say, you know, my brother or whatever can hold on to my firearms, you know, am I going to lose that connection with the other veterans in my life? So these are all things that can make it a little bit of a tougher sell with vets. So as I mentioned earlier, so in 2014, collaboration began between the Harvard Injury Control Research Center Means Matter program. So Kathy Barber and Deb Azrael and Matt Miller from their team. Our local suicide prevention team here in San Francisco, and then some other VA stakeholders to develop and deploy a training for VA providers in effective lethal means safety counseling in vets. And the training draws in part from the counseling and on access to lethal means, the CALM course, with significant adaptations made that acknowledge the unique considerations that you need to keep in mind when you're working with vets. And the training is just one of several VA lethal means safety initiatives currently underway. So we give these things out like Halloween candy, gun locks. These are available and have been, I believe, since 2012. No questions asked at every VA facility. We give out firearm locks. There's a lot of collaborations going on around lethal means safety efforts, a number of PSAs that have been developed, things like that. So the lethal means safety counseling training was first designed as about an hour and a half to 2 hour face-to-face training for providers. That's still the format we give in San Francisco to our trainees and staff, and to community partners. Again, reach out if you're interested. And in 2017, the Rocky Mountain MIREC, which is sort of the central brain trust for suicide prevention in the VA, adapted the training into a 60-minute online course that's available to all VA providers. And as of September, it was estimated that over 150,000 VA providers have completed this online course. And then one other thing to know about lethal means safety counseling. So the VA takes a public health approach to suicide prevention. So every VA patient gets at least one suicide risk screening each year. And every patient that is assessed to be at intermediate or high acute risk for suicide is offered suicide prevention safety planning. And safety planning is it's sort of a hierarchical list of coping and resources that a vet can draw on in a crisis. And it's sort of 6 methodical steps that you run through with the veteran. And the 6th step is lethal means safety counseling. It's what can you do to make your environment as safe as possible during periods of crisis. So that gives you some idea too about how lethal means conversations often go. You know, it's usually occurring. It's not a vet is coming in and saying I'm suicidal, and then we say, do you have guns? You know, it's not sort of that abrupt. It's very often coming after a lengthy suicide risk assessment and in the process of safety planning. So oftentimes you've built considerable rapport and you've got some knowledge around sort of what the vet's home situation looks like. Okay, so I'm just going to rocket through a whirlwind sort of thumbnail sketch of the training. I'm just going to show you a few slides for each of these sections, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. So we start out by establishing compelling evidence-based rationale for the importance of considering lethal means when targeting suicide. We begin with a review of some of those aforementioned population-based studies. This is a study about that Lubin, or this is a slide about that Lubin IDF study I mentioned earlier. And we do this to establish the connection between decrements of lethal means access and reduced suicide rates. We then focus in on some of the putative drivers of those population level findings. One of those is the time-limited nature of many suicidal crises. So this Austrian study, they looked at 82 people who had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt, and they asked them how much time had elapsed between their decision to make a suicide attempt and the attempt that put them in the hospital. 48% said 10 minutes or less. So we then discuss a couple of review studies that have found that 9 out of 10 people who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. And we then establish a corollary rationale that details the importance of considering firearms when thinking about lethal means safety counseling. And we run through a number of different studies that have illuminated the markedly higher fatality rates of firearms as a means for suicide. So this is one of the slides we use to that end. This is a national study that found about 90% of attempts via firearm are fatal. You know, by comparison, 0.7% of attempts via cutting are fatal. So we really drive that point home with the folks that get this training as well. And then a subsequent case is established for the particular importance of addressing firearms among the veteran population. We use a number of the slides I detailed earlier. And broadly, the take-home message is that if suicidal crises are often temporary and 90% of suicide attempt survivors don't ultimately die by suicide, and the lethality between suicide methods varies tremendously, then what you reach for in a suicidal crisis matters a lot, and steps to reduce easy access to highly lethal means during periods of elevated risk may go far in improving long-term outcomes. So once we've established that rationale, We shift to enumerating support that's been shown in various important constituencies for lethal means safety counseling. And the goal of this section of the training is really to allay providers' concerns regarding this question. Is it really okay to talk about guns with patients? So we start by detailing support for lethal means safety counseling at the highest levels of the VA. This support has persisted across the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. At the DoD VA National Suicide Prevention Conference in Denver in 2017, suicide prevention was identified as the #1 clinical priority of the VA, and lethal means safety was identified as one of 5 major strategic themes for reducing veteran suicide. We were all very excited to see that because there had been some concern that with the Trump administration, sort of the plug might get pulled on this, but in fact, they embraced it quite robustly. The training then discusses widespread and fertile collaborations that have occurred between suicide prevention groups and various firearm advocacy organizations around lethal means safety. These collaborations have occurred in over 20 states per a 2017 JAMA Psychiatry article. And there's also been a recent national collaboration between the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the National Shooting Sports Foundation. And we then touch on a number of studies of vets, which have shown varying degrees of support for lethal means safety counseling. And finally, we cover some of the emerging research supporting lethal means safety counseling as a potentially useful tool in suicide prevention. And I will underscore that the data supporting it is pretty slim at this point, but it's a burgeon, it's increasing, it's coming out. I think that'll be quite different in 5 years. We then spend the majority of the training covering the spirit and the nuts and bolts of effective lethal means safety counseling. We devote a significant amount of time to the importance of establishing adequate framing and a clear rationale for inquiring about lethal means with vets. This is something that I think is really central to the entire endeavor. Very often, in busy settings like emergency departments, we're going 100 miles an hour. Veteran makes a disclosure that they're feeling suicidal, and unfortunately, we then break out kind of the checklists. We get really robotic, and we sort of can stop the framing that can be really important to sort of putting folks at ease. And that's particularly important when you're talking about folks' gun rights. So we spend a lot of time about establishing a good rationale. We then cover sort of a hierarchy of storage options that we encourage providers to make sure that they touch on with every veteran that they're working with. And we focus throughout on the optimal therapeutic and interpersonal approach. So lethal means safety counseling is rooted in the central tenets of motivational interviewing. Providers are encouraged to try to evoke the change and the desire to change from within the patient rather than simply telling them what to do. It's intended to be a highly collaborative affair. Provider serves as a resource. Veteran is the expert on their own lived experience. You're walking side to side on the journey. And indeed, vets often generate hugely creative solutions on their own. I've had some incredible conversations with vets where they've come up with amazing strategies to reduce their access. And also lethal means safety counseling acknowledges autonomy. Veterans' preferences, they're paramount, right? All of this is voluntary. I mean, these are conversations that are occurring when we're not talking about a 5150. We're not talking about an involuntary hold. It's just people that are at elevated risk, but aren't quite at that place yet. And so autonomy is sort of the coin of the realm, and it really has to be for these conversations to go well, because if you've got an agenda that, your goal is to take every veteran's firearm out of their home, you're not going to get very far. So providers are encouraged throughout to be mindful of language they utilize in lethal means safety conversations. We talk about a few studies that have shown that slight changes in language, so things like means safety versus means restriction, and firearm rather than gun, may lead to lethal means safety being much better received. And then sort of the last part of the training, and kind of our favorite part, we usually will break up the trainees or whoever's attending the training into small groups and cover some of the more common sources of pushback and resistance. We call these the "What do I say when" slides, and we basically have the groups chew over how they might handle each of these sort of scenarios. So this one, guns have been a part of my family's traditions for generations. I have suicidal thoughts sometimes, but it's important for me to go hunting with my sons this weekend. We let the folks come up with their answers, and then we give some of our own. With my PTSD since coming home from deployment in Afghanistan, I don't feel safe unless my gun is loaded with me at all times. I even keep it under my pillow at night, and so on and so forth. So that's it. Sorry, that was 20 minutes is rough. I'm not a very brevity is not my strong suit. But I want to just underscore here. So if you're interested in that CALM course, That is available for free via the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. And the link for that is there. I'd also really encourage y'all check out the Means Matter website, the Harvard School of Public Health. It's very cool. And again, here's our contact information for my whole team. Please do reach out if you're interested in anything we've covered today, or if you're interested in getting this training for sure. I'd love to talk about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tate, for that great presentation. You packed a lot into your 30 minutes. We have a couple questions in the chat, but real quick, let's do our closing poll that Ramisha will post. If you all don't mind, we love to get your feedback. This helps us refine our materials in our course. So this will take, again, about a minute. Okay, great. And I think the poll is closed. I want to thank everybody for attending. And just a reminder that there will be another webinar on November 16th on hospital-based violence intervention programs. We'd love for you to join us for that one as well. We had a few questions in the chat, but given that we are right at the edge of time, I think that we'll maybe include those in our next registration email to participants. We'll put some answers in the email. And we hope to see you next month. So thank you again so much, Dr. Guelzow, and all of our participants for coming to our webinar series.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.